The Sunfallen Road, Book 3, The Road to Etienne-Gebert, Chapter 14. I watched Silver plow through textbooks and papers over the next 6 years as he buried himself in schoolwork. He decided to study theology at the university and minor in philosophy. Not an easy major. I said this to him, but he just smiled and said, "What's the point in studying something I don't care about? Come on, Mel." I knew he was right, so I just smiled and told him that whatever would make him happy was fine with me. The way we joined together was strange. One day he was just a young man staying in my spare room. Then, eventually, one night, we had confessed to the love we bore one another, and everything changed. We lived together joyously. We made plans for the future, as any human couple would. We helped one another in all things. It was this kind of union I knew I had been missing, while I was missing from the world in all but my work. His junior year, though, he came home one day with a face full of worry. He looked so lost that I put aside my text and went to him and hugged him. He hugged me back, and he looked at me and said, "I've been wondering where this is going to lead, Melpomene." I knew instantly what he meant. We'd been an established couple for several years now. I'd met some of his college friends and entertained some of them in the home we now shared. We loved each other without qualification, and in the years since he'd come into my life, I had moved more and more away from the vampire world and into the human one, aside from my consistent need to hunt. But I knew he was wondering if we could ever really be as other couples were, or even if we could ever marry. It was something I'd wondered, too. I took his hand and I led him into the machine room. We sat on the couch, and for a few moments we were quiet as I considered what to say. Finally, I spoke. "I don't see that we have to be different," I said. "Why should we be?" "But you won't die," he said. "You'll never die." "I will." "So you want to be like me?" I demanded. "No," he said, looking at me. "But what will happen when I'm gone?" I smiled and took his hand. "I'll go on as I always have. But, Silver, it doesn't matter how long you'll live. I love you, and however much time I have with you, I want to have." He nodded. "I think you're right." He leaned forward to kiss me, and when he'd done it, he asked me, "Can vampires get married?" I laughed. "Of course, but only at night," and I winked. He laughed hard. "Good to know." He worked hard at school and graduated summa cum laude with a double degree in theology and philosophy. Thankfully, his graduation ceremony was in the evening, so I was able to attend. I screamed and applauded just as loud as everyone else when he crossed the stage. I knew any number of folk had been dramatically disappointed over the years Silver had spent at school. He was so beautiful, and he was kind to everyone. He'd even grown a couple more inches in his freshman year, and his eyes were still as blue as the Mediterranean at high noon, his long black hair even longer. But he'd only ever had eyes for me, and I was thankful for it, because he was all I wanted. He went on to graduate study and finished his master's degree in just a year instead of the usual 2. He hemmed and hawed about doctoral study until finally I said to him, "Look, if you want to do it, just get off your ass and do it." I'd surprised him enough that he applied to a doctoral program in theology and was accepted readily. He joked that he'd better become a professor after finishing his degree, since with a doctorate he'd be officially unemployable. I laughed, partly because I knew he'd invested his money wisely at my suggestion, and even though he'd spent significant amounts on schooling, he'd be fine for some time yet if he didn't get a professorship. But I knew he was happiest when he was working, and I wanted him to be happy. He did a year of postdoctorate research, and the following summer he was offered a professorship in philosophy at the University of Chicago. It was almost unheard of. He was only 28. When he showed me the letter, his eyes wide with shock, I just smiled. The same evening, he brought me out to dinner at our favorite sushi restaurant, the one we'd gone to together so many years before. After dinner, he pulled a box from his pocket. I already knew what he was going to do before he did it, but I could scarcely contain my joy. "Melpomene Gabriela Maria Aguilar," he said to me, kneeling by my chair, heedless of the many patrons who had turned to smile knowingly at us. "I don't need to tell you what is in my heart, because you know already. but you are my love and my life, and would you do the honor of becoming my wife? He opened the box to reveal a beautiful ring of white gold and set with sapphires rather than diamonds. He knew they were my favorite. I closed my eyes. I knew what this would mean. Our lives would be conjoined but separate, and one day he would die. But I knew in that moment also that I would rather have one instant in my long, long life with him than let him slip by me into nothingness, having never shared everything I could with him. I opened my eyes again and leaned forward, my nose touching his. The honor would be mine. I want nothing more than to be your wife. He laughed and rose to his feet, sweeping me out of my chair and kissing me right in front of everyone. The restaurant erupted into applause. We were married a few months later, at night, of course, and although some of the guests remarked on the unusual hour of the ceremony, it was beautiful. My silver off-the-shoulder dress had been custom-made at a millinery in the city center, but all the flowers for the wedding were flowers from our own garden. The Lady de la Rue, of all people, served as my maid of honor. We'd maintained our friendship since meeting a decade before, and Silver and I had often gone to visit her. She had brought 2 of her own attendants to serve as bridesmaids, and they all looked lovely in the silver gowns with burgundy sashes that I had chosen. Silver's best man was the head of the theology department at the university, with whom he'd become good friends over the years of his study. The ushers were several of his classmates, all of whom I knew and all of whom I had had in our home on many occasions. The lot of them were very fond of me, something for which I was grateful. Although I had become an adept enough hostess, they always teased me about being so serious. It surprised me how much I had learned from being in the company of humans, among them a better sense of humor. Although Silver was deeply religious, we opted to have the ceremony conducted by a judge rather than a priest, and in a Unitarian cathedral rather than a Christian one. Afterwards, we drove to a banquet hall in the city for the reception, and the entire wedding party, the judge included, had a romping good time. We ate and drank and danced until the very late hours, but fortunately no one was so drunk that they met with misfortune. And my husband, what a strange thing to think of him as now, had nothing to drink at all but the customary glass of champagne for the toast. Both Marguerite and the theology professor gave beautiful speeches for the 2 of us, and for the first time in many years, aside from being with Silver, I felt so touched that I could have cried. I didn't, though. I knew my bloody tears would frighten someone, even if they only thought that perhaps I was sick. But the expression on my face told Silver everything he needed to know about how I was feeling, and we smiled at each other, and he kissed me. It's strange now that although Silver and I had never withheld ourselves physically from one another during the course of our relationship, our wedding night is now the only night aside from the first time that's stuck in my memory beyond all the other times. He blazed like a burning city that night, and I don't think I'd ever been more in love with him than I was that night. When I think about him now, I always think of our wedding day and night, the smiles and kisses and love that passed between us, and I think that perhaps no other day better represents how much in love we were with one another than that day. He began his professorship that autumn with enthusiasm, but as time passed, he began to question, not with his voice, but with his eyes and his mind. The more he taught, the more he learned. The more he learned, the more he shared with me, and the more he shared, the more our conversations leaned toward the question he had asked me so many years before. Did I want to be human again? I still had no answer.